All right, Jaden, can you confirm that we are live streaming?
Yes, let me double check the YouTube page. We are good to go.
All right, thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. This is Chair French convening the public workshop that we have scheduled for today, August 1st. I'm joined by Commissioner Keither, and Commissioner Keen is absent today. He is traveling. This is in docket numbers 24 EKME 253 CPL and 24 EKCE 254 CPL. And this is a presentation discussion by Evergy Kansas Metro and Evergy Kansas Central regarding their compliance filings pursuant to Kansas House Bill 2225 and K.S.A. 1237. The topic of this, as required by that House Bill 2225, the commission is to hold a public workshop in which representatives of the public utility present details associated with transmission projects that they're anticipated in the succeeding calendar year. And this public workshop will allow for questions and comments from the commission staff, and representatives of the Citizens Utility Ratepayer Board. So with that, I've gotten all my introductory scoping out of the way, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Evergy for your presentation. It looks like we have Steve Vetch. Are you leading the presentation today and introducing your team?
Yeah, Chairman French, that's exactly right. We've got a presentation that we'll share here in just a minute. I've got Katie Onen with me today. The two of us will be doing the majority of the presenting today. I'll kick it off, kind of lay the foundation, hand the baton to her. She'll go through our planning process, the different drivers for transmission investment. She'll also go through a more in-depth discussion and considerations on kind of how we rack and stack the projects that we're potentially considering for transmission investment. I'll at the end go through the 4 projects just for this year that qualify under the statute. So it's a little bit less robust or less voluminous than it was last year for the presentation. We also, at the request of staff, didn't include a lot of information about the Southwest Power Pool processes. So just from a volume, just the amount of pages, I guess, in our deck, it's a little bit lighter than it was last year. And also, too, there'll be some limitations on what we can share about the project, so similar to last year. So any questions before we get going on kind of handing the baton to Katie, having her go through, I think, the meat of our presentation and hopefully get you all the questions, all the answers you might have.
None for me. I say go for it.
All right. I will say, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in whenever, or we can wait to the end, whatever you would prefer. All right. So Steve went over the objectives today. We're going to provide a high-level overview of our planning process and drivers of transmission investment. We're going to talk a little bit about how we prioritize all of the projects that we have, and we're going to describe the drivers of the projects that we have included in this year's compliance filing. So with our systematic planning process, we start with identifying needs. These needs can come from a lot of different drivers. They can be related to asset condition, load growth, capacity needs. We look at contingency for providing flexibility to customers, and something that's been happening more frequently are changes in the generation mix. That's been a big thing that we've been looking at recently as well. So as soon as we identify these needs, come up with a list of needs, we're looking at what are the solutions that we can implement to resolve those needs. And those fall into 2 buckets. The first bucket is projects, which are specifically tailored to resolve 1 or 2 needs in a specific area. And then the other one is programs. And programs target a specific type of asset, typically, that are kind of all over our system that need to be replaced for one reason or another. So So we are looking at the holistic view of this asset needs to be replaced, and we're going to go through and replace it regardless of kind of where it is on the system. After we look at the solution or identify the solutions, we're creating estimates, and then we're going into project prioritization. We always have more projects on our system than we can do in any given year or even any given 5-year period. So we're looking at which projects are most needed or the most urgent that we should do first, which ones could be pushed out a few years, or we could do quick fixes and kind of make do with what we've got now until later on. There's also some project interdependencies. We have to do project A before we do project B. We can't take both, multiple lines out in a similar area due to the outages and reliability needs in that area. So just because our top 2 projects may be, or needed projects may be in the same area, we won't be able to do them at the same time. After that, we look at the holistic plan with a cross-functional leadership team, and then we start execution. I will say with these large projects that we're talking about today, we're looking at, once we get to the execution, which we've already been looking at these projects for quite a while by that point, it's still going to be 36 to 48 months before we can actually get that project in service. So the focus of today's discussion is mostly in the bucket on the far right, the performance bucket. We have a lot of different drivers, like I said, related to the last slide. Some of them are ones that we identify on our own. Those are mostly performance. There are other mandatory projects. Some are SPP directed, either to interconnect new load generation, or there's also a bucket of SPP projects that are base plan funded. Those typically come out of the integrated transmission planning process and are cost allocated highway by way according to the voltage level, and the costs are shared regionally typically. Load growth and new customers, we have to serve the new customers and do the projects that are required to do that. So those are mandatory. And then there are other mandatory projects like road moves. There are compliance requirements that we have to do. And then just emergent needs, storm restoration, failures that we need to go out and replace. So those are all kind of mandatory. We don't really have an option of whether to do them. Whereas with performance projects, we're able to prioritize those projects. We're looking at studies, holistic studies, to identify what's best for the system, how can we improve the system to better serve our customers. This shows the breakdown between those mandated and performance projects. About 26% of the spend from 24 to 28, the transmission spend, 26% is in that mandated category, and 74% is in that performance. And that includes the aging condition, and all those needed for operational flexibility are identified through our local planning processes. So here we talk about how we prioritize projects. We score each project, and this is us trying to kind of make an art into a science and assign some kind of scores. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes into it than you can quantify. So there's an art to it as well. But for those mandated projects, we're assigning a fairly high score. So those are kind of passed through when we're looking at them. We know we have to do them. We don't really have a choice. So those we want to make sure are included. All of the performance projects, we are looking at a combination of reliability and public impact, employee benefit, and growth and technology. You can see the breakdown on the slide of how much weight is put into these specific areas, with the highest weighting being on that customer reliability. One thing I would say on the under employee benefit, we do mention safety risk, and this is for specific projects that have a workaround. If there's an actual safety risk where there is no workaround or there isn't a way to do something, even if it takes a little bit longer, those are going to be mandated. But these are just kind of tying into the productivity, and if there is a workaround that is feasible, then that goes into the performance projects and is an employee benefit.
Katie, I've got a question on that last slide.
Yep.
So this is really helpful to have the metric of how you score this. But maybe to give me a little more color, one thing, I know I've expressed this before, but one thing I'm really interested in is when you're doing these, particularly the performance projects related to, what we would call like local transmission, the consideration of not just rebuilding the configuration that currently exists, but looking for opportunities to, as FERC might say, right size it, or as others might say, optimize maybe a larger solution, but maybe a less costly overall solution that could maybe solve multiple needs and is better suited to, what the grid needs in the future rather than what it needed when you originally built it 60 years ago. How much do you all have those conversations when you're scoping out projects, looking 5 or 10, 15 years out, and what buckets do those fall in here?
Yeah, so typically when we're looking at potential solutions, if there are multiple, or when we're looking at needs, if there are multiple needs popping up in a specific area, we'll look holistically at that area to see if there's a kind of a portfolio of projects that could maybe resolve those issues in a way that rebuilding the existing system as it stands today wouldn't do. We call them local area studies. So we'll focus on that area. We'll get input from a lot of different areas, a lot of different departments within Evergy, and we'll also talk to wholesale customers if they'll be impacted as well. So we'll look at it and say, if we were to design the system today with what we know and what we expect to happen in the future, is there a better way of doing it? And we'll come up with a portfolio for that. And those honestly wouldn't fit into any one of these categories, but when we're scoring those, obviously they're going to impact all of these. If they have an impact on critical customers, obviously that's going to go into the score as well.
Yeah, that's helpful. I was trying to shoehorn it into a couple of these bullet points, but good point that it's going to impact them either way. And I guess from my perspective, it's good to know that conversation is taking place. Probably would be good to see that memorialized in some way, but really good to hear that you all are having that conversation. So go ahead, and I don't see any other hands.
Can you clarify what you mean by memorialized?
Yeah, I mean, like what you've given here of having these bullet points for scoring, I mean, those are memorialized, that's your scoring metric. If you had it memorialized in writing somewhere for us that you are considering, more holistic reconfigurations, different configurations that exist today, either within some sort of process document, I think that would be helpful. It would give our staff something to sink their teeth into and ask you, okay, here's your process document. What did you consider when you reached this point? If that explains it.
Okay.
Hey, Commissioner, can you hear me?
Yeah, Kim. Yep.
Yeah, so one of the projects that we'll cover in somewhat greater detail later is an example of a project that we're doing, which is part of a 10-year plan, right? So it's this systematic plan executed over about a decade. And I think it speaks to exactly what you're asking. Are we looking at things more holistically, the greater good over a really long period of time, kind of total value, if you will, rather than piecemealing the system together, looking at into the future and what we anticipate to happen and having a plan to execute.
Great. Thank you.
when we're looking at potential projects and needs on the system, obviously they're not just driven, like I mentioned, they're not just driven by one thing or the other. We're looking at age and condition, we're looking at local or zonal planning, and we're looking at operational issues. And the local and zonal planning, we talked about local planning last year. There was a question about zonal planning. We're kind of in an in-between period where we've gotten our zonal planning criteria passed. We had it passed in January, and this is actually our first iteration of zonal planning and using our zonal planning process and identifying projects and submitting them to SBP. So I have local and zonal here because a lot of these projects were developed through our local process, but going forward, it will be more on the zonal side. So as we look at the graphs on the right side, this is breaking down kind of the needs over time due to these three buckets of age and condition, local, zonal planning, and operational issues. So for age and condition, you typically see for a while it being fairly flat related to the risk. And then once you hit a certain age, the risk of that asset failing will go up pretty quickly. For local and zonal planning, you see kind of as you look over 5 or 10 years into the future, you're seeing load growth or changes on the system that kind of incrementally increase the risk of or the need to do that project over time. And then with operational issues, these are kind of periods in time, short periods in time where we're seeing issues on the system. Most likely operational issues are because when we're planning the system long term, we're looking at taking out a single what we call contingency or a single event occurring on the system at a time and looking at the impact of that. Well, when we're operating the system, very rarely do we have the entire system intact. We have work going on in different places. We have outages existing. So we're already in that what we call N-1 situation. And so we're always looking at if we lose the next piece of equipment, line, transformer, if we lose that next thing, then what is our situation going to be? And that's how we're operating the system. So we have those operational issues that kind of pop up over time. So then this shows when you overlap those, you see the combined risk of the aging condition and local planning and operational issues. So all of those together are really driving the need for the projects. So here we have an overview of our local and zonal. I talked about this a little bit earlier. We did get this zonal planning criteria passed. It is pretty close to what Evergy was using as our local planning criteria prior to that. It was unanimously agreed to by all the transmission owners and transmission customers in Evergy zones. So just to clarify for zones, if you're not familiar, it's an SPP term, SPP zone. So Evergy actually has 3 different zones. We have the Evergy Kansas Central zone, the Evergy Metro zone, and Evergy Missouri West. All 3 zones have identical zonal planning criteria with one exception being voltage criteria at our Wolf Creek plant in our Kansas Central zone. So that's the only difference, and obviously we don't need that in the other 2 zones. So we're using this criteria and we're working with the customers and owners in our zone to work on these long-term studies and work to identify the needs and the solutions for this local planning criteria. Those will be submitted to SPP for evaluation in the next year. So this is an ongoing annual process. Every year we're going to be doing the zonal planning process. And I think now I'm handing it back over to Steve.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
All right. Good time to break for questions if there are any.
I don't have any, and I've been kind of monitoring our list of participants, and I don't see any hands. But if anybody's having trouble finding the raise hand feature, feel free to just go off of mute. I don't see anybody leaping at the opportunity though, Steve. So I think you can continue, and they can interrupt just as I've done. So
Yeah, perfect. And I, like I think we said before, Katie and I, both prefer to be interrupted on the fly, if you will. It's just a little bit easier to keep track of the questions when they're on the content that you're actually speaking about. So, welcome any questions. Please feel free to chime in anytime. Age and condition, and we went through this probably I won't say just a little bit last year, exactly like we're gonna hear now last year. Age in and of itself is not a driver of transmission investment. We have a lot of very well tenured or long tenured, very well seasoned assets out there on our system that are performing very, very well. They're not at any grave danger of failing, any more likely of failure than something that's much younger. So we don't, as a result of the count of years something's been out there, invest dollars in our transmission system. But when we're assessing the condition, right, and this is where age and condition kind of intersect, we generally and most often find that our most aged assets are also the ones that are of poor condition, which I think is sensible and logical to most folks. How do we assess the condition? So we do it two ways. So the first thing we do, as required by NERC, is we go out and we do an aerial inspection of every single transmission line on our system annually. We do our 345 system twice a year just because of the criticality of that portion of our system. The other way that we assess the health of our transmission system is we do a detailed inspection intrusive at the pole level or ground level every 12 years. So we're on a 12-year cycle. We're taking the information that we learned from the aerial inspection, which is things that you'll see on the right, a lot of broken cross arms, failed insulators on occasion. Every so often we'll find a line that has come away from the insulator. So certainly that's something we'd have to repair right away. But generally the stuff that we're finding overhead, you'll see our folks out there repairing that if it's somewhat in an urban area. The detailed intrusive inspections, this is us going out, digging around the pole a little bit and in boring, sounding, making sure or finding out what kind of decay is in the pole, and then making a determination on what the resilience of the pole is, what's its ability to withstand forces from any side. Generally, the poles will fail at the ground level, which again I think makes sense because the ground kind of works as a fulcrum when there's some pressure on the pole. Not that they can't fail further up on the pole or slightly below the ground line. I say in this business, we generally don't use the words always or never, but most often, right? So that's how we go about assessing the condition. And then we'll take back all of the information that we found from both sets of inspections and make a determination on how we're going to go about mitigating what we found if it needs mitigation.
Hey, Steve, here's a silly question. I'm never afraid to ask these.
Love it.
Your picture there with the pole cross section got me thinking. It's showing the actual tree rings, the material that it was cut from. We've all heard the discussion that lumber today is not what it used to be, and I imagine you had poles that are, say, they're 80 years old. They're probably old growth, tightly packed. Lumber, really strong. The stuff today is probably not a bunch of old growth lumber. It's probably more standardized. It probably looks a little prettier initially, but does it have kind of the same expected life that some of that old lumber had, or is it of a different quality?
Yeah, I will answer like this. It's claimed to have a life similar to what was put in previously or its predecessors. It's a really hard question to answer, Chairman, and it's because of this reason, right? If you have two poles that are planted right next to each other, right, and then you can somewhat make a determination on which was the better quality pole. But we have such a variety of ground that we're putting the poles in. So if you've got one that's high in the Flint Hills in a rocky area, doesn't see a lot of wet weather. and you've got one kind of that's planted closer to a low-lying area in a swamp or in a valley that sees a lot of, higher winds, it's hard to make the determination, was it the pole or was it the outside influences on the pole that made it weather quicker than its counterpart? So I really can't answer the question. I can just say that they're advertised as being as good as their predecessors.
Yeah, and I imagine there's different treatments today that are applied than probably we had access to 60 or 80 years ago as well.
I will say the environmental controls over what we were treating the poles with 60 or 70 years ago is a lot different than is allowed today.
Okay, that's great. Like I said, it's kind of a silly question, but sparked my curiosity.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. Okay. Again, kind of, what do we do with the information that we've acquired during the assessment? And I don't know if there's a thought out there, but we generally don't go to rebuild the line when we found some poles that are of poor quality or in danger of failing. We go through this mental exercise of, okay, what makes the most sense here? It's a little bit about, like what Katie was talking about previously. With what we're finding during the health assessment of a particular circuit, does maintenance make the most sense here? How old is the overall circuit? What's the criticality of the circuit? What's wrong with it? What's the anticipated investment needed to shore it up to a level that we're comfortable with? I would say more often than not, this is the arena that we fall in. Moving to the right targeted replacements. One of the things I think is not always obvious to everybody is that if you take any one of our 345 lines on our system, they're each about 100 miles in length. So the variety of, weather, topography, just the various different impacts or weather that each part of that circuit will see is much different than other portions of the circuit. So you end up with stretches that are much less reliable than other stretches, even though they may have been in service at exactly the same time. They're just exposed to different nature, right? So we end up a lot of the times going through some of these circuits and finding portions of them or stretches of them that need attention, need pole replacements, need new cross arms, need braced up, where other portions of the line that were in service at exactly the same time are totally fine. So it's a little bit like we were talking about before. And I would say, in the maintenance and the targeted replacement, that's where we spend the majority of volume in terms of circuits that we're working on. And then at some point, and I know we have a little car analogy at the bottom there, and I used one last year because my wife and I had a car issue, just happened to be right the week before we were visiting about this. You get to a place where incremental investment in a line just doesn't make a lot of sense because it needs a complete rebuild at some time in the not too distant future. In those incremental dollars that you're spending aren't going to be totally valued, right? You're not going to get to the end of the useful life of those assets when you go and rebuild the line. So once we determine that we've got a line that's candidate for a total rebuild, I mean, we're going to do what we have to keep the line in the air, in the circuit in service. But we're generally very, very cautious about how much money we would invest in a line that we know we're going to have to rebuild in the next probably 5 years. So, in the rebuilding too, although it's from a dollar standpoint, something we're going to talk a lot about in these forums because they meet the threshold more often than the counterparts to the left. In terms of total work, we've had a handful of these things going on, but the majority of what we're working on is in the two kind of buckets to the left. And any questions on any of that? Okay.
Not from me, but we'll give you an opportunity to take a drink.
Yeah.
Buy you some time.
Yeah, no, I always got to have a little water. So we're going to talk about the projects that fall inside the confines of the statute, really the things that we're required to talk about while we're here. Just a little bit of an overview on what qualifies and what doesn't. So anything that is hitting our TDC in the next 2 years, so 25 and 26, that's greater than $15 million qualifies for inclusion into the workshop today. I will say last year was our first year doing this, so we did the projects that were in servicing in 24 and 25. We won't be covering again the projects for 25. I do have a slide that shows the differences in what we told you last year and what we know today, but we're planning on covering just what's in servicing in 26 today, so just 4 projects. And then kind of a disclaimer at the bottom, we're living in a world that's, somewhat volatile. Our best plans sometimes get changed. Sometimes we have projects that we're going to talk about and we're planning to in service that we end up not in servicing. And we can certainly go through the drivers of all that and why the plan's a little bit different today than it may have been just a year ago. So certainly open to any and all questions regarding what's different than we talked about last year. Okay, so this is a summary of projects that are included in our filing. I'm not going to go through all the projects on the list here, but one of the things that I do want to point out is that when we're choosing projects, when our team that Katie was talking about earlier is assessing things that we may invest in, they're trying to solve more than one issue with one project, right? So if we've got a aging condition and a local planning problem and an operational issue, that we're choosing projects that give us the best bang for our dollar. And that's why you'll see more than kind of 1x on one project as we're going from left to right. There are projects from an aging condition standpoint that are just so beyond the end of their useful life, even though they may not be adding planning or solving for planning or operational issues, that the risk of having those assets out in the field is just greater than the company can bear. And if you think about, and I'm sure you're aware of how much attention and concern around wildfires there's been, not just in California and Colorado and in some places that aren't Kansas, but here too, right? So it's a concern for us, something that we're working to mitigate, and a risk that we can't take. So if we have assets that we feel are beyond their useful life, pose a risk to us, not only from a wildfire standpoint, but also from a just reliability and service standpoint, they'll make the cut, and we'll talk about them here in the workshop and be happy to do so. Okay, so what's new? Again, we've got the 4 projects. And again, we're going to be able to get into some level of detail here, commissioners. We're probably not going to get into a lot of detail. If you want things that we either can't or aren't comfortable talking about in a public setting, we can go to a closed session and we'll pull the curtain back here and tell you and show you all the things we know about all the drivers and exactly what it is we're doing here. So certainly not trying to be evasive, but there are some limitations on what we can share publicly here. Okay, so this is a substation rebuild. It's the driver of the projects for asset age and condition. It also has operational issues. These 2 transformers were set back in the 30s and 50s, or let me rephrase, they were set back in the 50s. The substation was built in the 30s. There's still a lot of the original equipment in this substation. The transformers are, failing. I won't be overly dramatic about this. They're not catastrophically failing. They're not going to not make it to the end of the week, but they are nearing the end of their useful life. They're also not adequate in size to accommodate the load. So the major reason and driver for the replacement here. They got brown glass insulators on them. And I would say for this particular project, it falls in the end of its useful life, asset aging condition. It's a risk that we can't continue to take at this substation. There are very, very limited recovery options in this part of our service territory. So it's on the list, it's getting funded, and it'll get completed.
When you say there's limited recovery options, do you mean it's a more radial area, or what are you referring to there?
Yeah, so there are not other substations that can pick up all of the load of this substation if this substation were to fail.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So transfer, I mean, I'll be a little more open about this. In our rural areas, not as much redundancy as you might find in an urban area, because the transformers generally are much further apart from each other. So that in our rural areas is just a risk that we have. And generally not an issue when we've got fairly, decent or somewhat newer equipment out there. But we get to a place like in this instance where, if you look at the transformer in the background there, I mean, it's time. Okay, a 138 conversion, and this was the project that I was referring to a little bit earlier in terms of executing on a long-term plan. So we had our long-term planning group, and this would have been probably more than a decade ago, did a long-term strategic study on this part of our service territory. And at the time that it was done, it was clear that the 69 kV, what I'll call loop in and around this area would not be adequate well into the future. And they began a process to convert that 69 system to a 138 system. This is part of that plan. Couple other things that are driving and motivating some of that discussion is if you look at the picture there in front of you, it's called a unitized switchgear. So on the left is the transformer, on the right is the switchgear. They're a single component or a single piece. We do not have these anywhere else on our system. We do not have these things in inventory. If what is in front of you were to fail, either part of it is, and generally why the industry went away from them, it damages or likely damages completely the other component. So you're then forced to bring in some sort of switchgear and some sort of transformer. But the driver really is a long, well thought out plan. I think it's really, really a benefit in certainly from a system sustainability standpoint and just voltage control. It really was a good decision made long ago. We're in the process of executing it. Of all of the steps that it was taking and will take to execute this plan from its beginning to kind of its end, I would say, in a football analogy, if we started on our own 20, we're about on the other 20 now, so we're getting pretty close to the end zone and being complete. I would say within the next several years, this plan will be complete. And this substation rebuild, I believe, is the last major substation rebuild related with this, and then we'll have some line conversions after that, but nearing the end of a long-term plan. Okay, 69 kV substation rebuild, asset aging condition. This project is one that's been on the radar for us for quite a while. Vintage of replaced facilities, 1979, certainly looks like a young candidate relative to some of the other things we've seen and talked about previously. And I would say, but for this substation being built in a floodplain, we wouldn't be executing on this project, but it has flooded twice in recent years. It feeds a major industrial customer, and it's just not a risk that we can continue to take. I cannot tell you if it was in a floodplain when it was built back in the probably mid 70s, but I can tell you it's in one now. It's causing us all sorts of issues. The water gets so high, it gets above all the relay panels inside the substation. So even after the water recedes, the time to kind of get it back online and get the customer restored, it's just really not acceptable service, and it's something that we need to do. In terms of thinking about, what else can we do if we're going to invest the dollars to build a new substation? What else is it we can do here? We'll be adding some distribution breakers to this substation. It will allow us to retire another antiquated substation that's in and around this area. So it's kind of, again, the planning group looking at things through what I call just a larger lens, not looking through a keyhole at a specific issue and solving just that thing. They're looking at a broader issue here and solving, I think, with a much more complex or maybe better solution for a larger area for a longer period of time. Okay, a new 345 substation. So this is actually in Missouri. This is a result of a new customer that is locating in Missouri. 345 substation. You can see the price tag there. The allocator in the metro between Missouri and Kansas is such that the amount of dollars that would be attributed to the Kansas metro portion of our service territory meets the threshold for inclusion today. But really no ability to not do this. This is something that I think is a benefit to really all of us, something that we're required to do. The customers locating here, we plan to serve them, and this substation is required to do so. Okay, so project update summary. I wasn't planning on going through probably all of these projects in detail. Some of the things that I'll hit on here is, the top one, that's in and around DeSoto. I think we've talked about that a lot. We did not have an NTC on that the last time we got together and had this discussion. We've since received one from the Southwest Power Pool. So that is a project that will be regionally allocated that we may have been unsure about when we last visited about that. Certainly glad to answer any of the questions that you might have on the differences in what we said last year and what we're saying this year. We've had one project that's went up a little bit, one that's went down a bit. But if you've got any curiosity around, the drivers for those things, we certainly would, happy to answer any questions anyone may have about any of that.
I don't have any questions on these items, and I'm still looking for hands. Maybe I'll go back and ask you one question, or I guess make one comment on the last slide, talking about the investment to serve the data center in Missouri, and of course those have been in the news. We've seen the press releases for a couple large data centers to be built, and to the extent there are folks from the public watching, you mentioned the benefit to customers here. But I think some people might be surprised if they don't follow rate making, to learn that Kansas customers are allocated a portion of the cost of facilities to serve a new data center in Missouri. I think, if I'm saying this right, Darren Ives or somebody can correct me, but we are, because it's a multi-state utility, we are allocated a portion of costs of facilities that are needed to serve in Missouri, but Missouri customers are also allocated a portion of costs that are invested in Kansas. And we also, in this situation, Kansas customers get the benefit of the additional revenue that's collected from a customer on the Missouri side, and vice versa. And generally that's how that works. So, I mean, I think it's worth calling that out, because I think, that's going to be a natural question that people ask, is why are Kansas customers helping to pay for an investment in Missouri? So if there's anything else you want to add to that, if you think I didn't accurately get it all across, feel free to tag on, but I think that's something that I could see piquing people's interest.
Yeah, so I think you nailed it pretty well, spot on. The only thing that I would add is if the data center was built in Kansas Metro, the opposite would also be true, right? So a portion of those dollars would be allocated to Missouri. Legacy K.S.A. being all service territory has been a multi-state jurisdictional utility for as long as it's been in existence. So kind of a long-standing just protocol there on how they're allocating costs across those two states.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. I know it's maybe a little outside scope, a little more into rate making, but I know it's something that people will be interested in. So you can go back to your next slide. I don't know if anybody's developed a question on your project list yet. Who scheduled this thing for 8 a.m.? You got a quiet crowd.
Well, I was more looking at the 2-hour window. I'm like, man, I'm looking at our deck and trying to figure out how we might stretch it into 2 hours.
I don't think you're going to get any complaints.
Okay. Okay, Cody, if there aren't any questions, we'll, I guess, move on to if there are any questions on anything we covered, or maybe something that you were hoping we might cover that we didn't cover. Again, our goal here is to make sure that we're able to be absolutely as transparent as we can be in the workshop, that we're getting the questions that you came to the meeting with answered, anything that may have developed during the meeting, answer those. Anything that you have that we are not able to answer, we'll certainly loop back and provide you those answers at some time later. But generally, this is our opportunity to talk about our transmission business, why we're doing what we're doing, how we're doing it, and hopefully get everybody, quality, just understanding of how the business is working. And I think that's part of why we've got the workshops.
Yeah, I don't have any more questions. I very much appreciate the presentation. It's statutorily required now, but I can say I think it's very valuable for us to get this update and sort of understand what the planning process is and, what the actual projects, sort of large driver projects are going on each year. So from my perspective, very beneficial to get the opportunity to ask questions. I'm still watching the participant panel to see if somebody's
Chad's got one.
brave
Yeah,
enough to raise it. Okay, go ahead, Chad.
so Commissioner French, and this is just for everybody's kind of information. Before we have this meeting from a commission perspective, staff and Curb both met with Evergy on July 9th. So we were able to kind of get a preview of the projects, ask additional questions, and kind of get some of the details that are confidentially held. That's primarily why staff does not have a lot of questions, because Evergy has been really good at getting us kind of answers and being able to kind of fully vet out these transmission projects. So I just kind of wanted to make that comment because they've been very kind of good about getting staff details when we needed it.
Very good. Yes, I neglected to mention that there is that second component of a stakeholder meeting before this meeting. So appreciate you pointing that out. Well, I didn't see Chad's hand, so I missed that one. So if there's anybody else that does have a question or wants to make a comment, go ahead and pop off mute. And if you don't, I think we're going to conclude. Mr. Vetch, do you have anything further from the company before we conclude?
Nothing substantial, right? I would only probably just add on to what I've already said. Thankful for the opportunity. I think this is a benefit, to every participant that's here. I think, historically, this portion of our business has been a little bit opaque. I'm glad that we're opening it up, making sure folks understand what we do and how we do it. There's really good reasons behind the things that we do. We're very acutely aware of how what we do impacts our customers. So making sure that we're choosing things that are of significant value long term to the customers, of which a lot of the folks that work here are, right? So we're just I think it's a good opportunity for us to tell what we've been up to and why we're doing what we're doing.
All right. Well, thank you. We really appreciate the opportunity. As I said, I think this is beneficial to get together each year and see the actual projects. So do appreciate it. And with that, we will go ahead and conclude the workshop. We thank you for your time. Oh, I
All
see
right,
we
thank
have
you.
a third commissioner joining us right at the end.
What a sense of timing, huh?
Exactly.
Thank
Well,
you for the presentation. That's been great.
You're very
thank you
welcome.
all. We are adjourned.
All right, great.